Jace Keller never planned on owning a broken-down garage on the forgotten edge of a city that never looked his way twice. Yet every morning, before the sunrise painted the concrete in bruised pinks and gold, he unlocked the rattling door of Keller's auto repair, flicked on the humming sign that barely glowed, and greeted the day like an old rival. He was a man who knew engines better than people, bolts better than words. It suited him fine. People lied, machines didn't. They broke down, they leaked, but they didn't betray. For Jace, that counted for something. Business was what you'd expect for a single-bay garage wedged between a pawn shop and an abandoned liquor store. Old Chevys with rusted frames, ancient pickups held together by hope and duct tape, the occasional delivery van that coughed up more oil than it carried packages. Some folks paid him in crumpled 20s. Some paid him in barter. Old radios, fresh vegetables from backyard gardens, a six-pack left on the counter as thanks. He didn't mind. It kept him afloat. He liked the work. He liked the silence. Mostly he liked being left alone. It was late October when she arrived, the kind of evening that turned the oil-slick pavement into mirrors for neon beer signs. Jace was wiping grease from his knuckles when the sound of tires crunching over loose gravel pulled his eyes up. A black SUV, way too new for this block, rolled in with a whine of protest. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped a woman whose boots had never met dirt before that night. She wore a coat that cost more than his whole month's rent, and sunglasses she didn't need in the dusk. She hesitated, scanning the garage, eyes darting to the peeling posters on the walls, the shelves cluttered with parts he'd salvaged from junkyards. Jace watched her watching him. "Car trouble?" he asked finally, voice rough from disuse. She flinched, like she'd forgotten he was there. "It just died," she said, gesturing helplessly at the SUV, smoke curling lazily from under the hood. "Won't start. I don't know what to do." He didn't answer. He just flicked his rag onto the bench, grabbed his flashlight, and popped the hood latch with one practiced tug. He leaned in, while she hovered near the open door, fingers twisting the leather straps of her purse. The heat from the engine poured out in waves. He sniffed the air, antifreeze, scorched rubber, maybe worse. "You're lucky you made it here at all," he muttered, mostly to himself. She stepped closer, perfume mixing with the sharp chemical stink. "Can you fix it?" she asked, voice softer now, as if she could sense she'd stepped into a world she didn't quite belong to. He didn't look up. "We'll see." He worked without talking. She tried to fill the silence. "I'm Lila, by the way, Lila Grant." Her name landed in the oil-thick air like a dropped coin. He gave her nothing. She cleared her throat, leaned against the SUV like she was afraid of dirtying her coat. "Do you ever close? It's late." He snorted. "Engines don't care about closing time." A ghost of a smile tugged at her painted lips. She studied him, the way his big hands moved, the smudge of grease on his jaw, the tattoo peeking under his rolled sleeve. An hour passed. She checked her phone every few minutes, typing messages she never sent. Once he caught her staring at him, like she was memorizing the lines of his shoulders. He ignored it. Rich folks were all the same, curious about grit, but never willing to stay long enough to understand it. He found the leak. A hose cracked, the clamp rusted out. He fetched a used piece from the corner, fitted it like a puzzle piece he'd solved 1,000 times before. When he was done, he shut the hood with a quiet finality. "It'll hold for now," he said, wiping his hands on his rag. "You should get it replaced properly. Next shop over in Midtown'll fleece you." But they got the parts. She didn't move. She just stood there, silhouetted by the flickering shop light, watching him with an intensity he didn't want to name. "Why do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Fix cars." He raised an eyebrow. "What else would I do?" She almost laughed, but her eyes looked sad. "You could do anything." He barked out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, who says I want to?" She pulled a credit card from her wallet, but he waved it off. "Cash only?" She blinked like she'd never heard those words before. She fumbled in her purse, came up with a few folded bills, more than he'd charge. He pocketed half, pushed the rest back. She didn't argue. Instead, she stepped closer, so close he could smell rain on her coat. "Thank you, Jace." He stiffened. "Didn't tell you my name." She shrugged. It's on the sign. He'd forgotten the faded letters above the roll-up door. Right, he muttered. She smiled again. When she climbed into the driver's seat, she lingered. He could see the way her hands trembled on the wheel. He wondered what kind of trouble she carried in a purse so small and boots so clean. She didn't start the engine right away, just sat there staring at the dashboard. "I'll see you around, Jace," she said finally, her voice lower than before. He nodded once, tapped the roof twice. "Drive safe." He watched the SUV's taillights vanish into the dripping dark, then turned back inside, alone with the smell of coolant and questions. Over the next week, she came back 3 times. The first was for a weird noise that wasn't really there. The second, she said she just wanted to make sure the hose was still holding. The third time, she brought coffee and sat on a battered stool near the tool chest while he worked on an old Ford. He hated how easy it was to get used to her voice weaving through the clang and hum of his tools. She asked him about everything. The photos taped to the dusty corkboard, the scars on his knuckles, the old tattoo inked in black. He never gave her much, but she didn't seem to mind. Sometimes she'd just watch him, her eyes drifting over the shop like she was cataloguing its chaos. He caught her once, tracing her finger along a faded picture of his dad leaning against a Dodge Charger. "You miss him?" she asked. Jace shrugged. "He taught me what I know." That was all he'd say. He didn't talk about the nights spent in the back office on a cot, or the years clawing back debt with busted knuckles and burned-out dreams. She never pushed. One evening, rain hammering the roll-up door like angry fists, she told him about herself. Not the public version, the stories the city papers ran about Lila Grant, the real estate queen. She told him about the cracks in the marble, the cold dinners, the meetings with men who called her darling while burying knives in her back. He listened, silent but steady, passing her an old metal mug of bitter coffee that tasted like rust and regret. She said it was the best thing she'd had in weeks. He almost believed her. Sometimes she'd catch him looking at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Once she caught his hand when he reached for a wrench she'd picked up by mistake. Their fingers brushed, oil and silk, grime and gold. He pulled away like she'd burned him. She only smiled, that knowing smile that made him feel like she could see every lie he told himself just to get through another day. He didn't want to need her visits. He didn't want her to be real. But each time she showed up, she made the silence inside him feel less sharp. One night she asked, "Do you ever wish it was different?" He didn't answer right away. The question hung between them, heavy as the rain outside. Finally he said, "Different isn't always better." She looked at him like she wanted to argue. Instead, she just nodded, like she'd expected that answer all along. She stood to leave, pausing by the door, fingers tapping the frame. "You ever want something different, Jace? You'll know where to find me." He pretended not to watch her go, but long after the sound of her engine faded, he stayed standing in that same spot. By the time winter cracked open the city sky with frost, she'd become a rumor in his mind he couldn't shake. She came and went, sometimes gone for weeks, sometimes showing up with fresh coffee and questions that left him too raw to answer. He didn't know her plan. He didn't know she had one. He only knew that when she walked in, the cold of the world stayed outside for a while, and that was enough. Until it wasn't. The first snow dusted the street outside Keller's auto like powdered sugar on rusted metal. Jace was bent under the hood of a beat-up Dodge when her headlights cut through the dusk. He didn't need to look up to know it was her. He felt her presence like the hum of an idling engine, something alive and insistent in the cold. She stepped out, coat wrapped tight, boots crunching over salt and gravel. In her hand, a paper bag. He straightened, wiping oil from his palms, eyes locking on hers with that unspoken question that never seemed to leave. She didn't say a word at first, just held out the bag. He took it, feeling the warmth of fresh food through thin paper. "You eat, don't you?" she asked, her voice playful but her eyes soft. He grunted, tearing into it without ceremony, half-starved and half annoyed at himself for caring that she cared. She leaned against the fender beside him, the SUV's warm lights catching her hair like fire. For a moment, the silence felt like a promise instead of a curse. He found himself wanting to believe it could stay that way forever. That night she didn't leave when he flipped the sign to closed. She stayed, perched on an old metal stool, while he worked on a carburetor that refused to cooperate. She asked about his first car, about the first fight he'd won, about the first thing he'd lost that really mattered. He gave her half answers, but she pieced them together like a puzzle she already knew how to finish. Her laughter bounced off the concrete walls, mixing with the hiss of the heater, fighting the creeping cold. He hated how good it sounded here. When he walked her back to her SUV, he noticed how her hands shook when she fumbled for the keys. She wouldn't look at him when he touched her wrist to steady it. "You okay?" he asked, voice low enough to drown in the drifting snow. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm always okay, Jace." He wanted to believe her. He didn't. He wanted to ask more, to press past the brick walls she carried under her expensive coat. But he just nodded and watched her drive away, taillights glowing like embers in the dark. 2 weeks passed, no sign of her. He told himself it was good. Clean, safe. He told himself 1,000 lies while replaying the memory of her leaning against his workbench, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled to her elbows like she belonged there. When she did return, she looked tired. The mask of polish she always wore had slipped a little, cracks in her perfect armor. She didn't bring coffee. She didn't bring stories. She just sat on the floor by the heater while he fixed a tire no one else wanted to touch. She didn't say a word. When he finally killed the buzz of the drill and wiped sweat from his brow, she spoke. "I need your help, Jace." Her voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it, but the steel underneath was impossible to miss. He tossed the rag aside. "With what?" She looked up at him, eyes darker than oil in moonlight. "I need you to trust me." He almost laughed. Trust was currency he hadn't traded in years. But something in her expression held him still, nailed him to the spot like a wrench, dropped on cold concrete. He nodded once. "Okay." She explained it in fragments. A deal gone bad, a man with too much power, a corner she couldn't fight her way out of alone. She'd come to him not for money or parts, but for sanctuary. For a man whose entire life had been about fixing broken things, he'd never imagined fixing a heart, or maybe a future, would feel this heavy in his chest. He didn't ask why him. He didn't want to know the real answer. He just closed the garage door, locked the bolt, and told her she could stay as long as she needed. They spent 3 days in that small garage, like it was an island against the storm outside. He taught her how to change brake pads, how to bleed a radiator, how to tell the difference between a healthy engine and one pretending to be. She told him about her father's empire built on debt and fear, about the boardroom snakes who smiled while sharpening knives. She never once asked him to fix her car this time. She asked him to fix something bigger, her trust in people, her belief that not every good thing turns rotten when you hold it too tight. On the 4th morning, they sat on the old bench behind the garage, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt hope. She leaned her head on his shoulder and he didn't move away. The sun cracked through the grey sky, turning the frost on the fence into tiny diamonds. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. He stared at the street, the potholes he knew by name, the rusted sign that carried his father's ghost. "Sometimes," he admitted. She smiled against his jacket. "Good, because when this is over, you're coming with me." He almost laughed, almost told her not to plan futures with a man like him, a man stitched together by old regrets and fresh oil stains. But he didn't. He didn't because for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a lie to want more. When night fell, they stayed side by side, the hum of the city beyond the garage walls, muffled by the warmth that had settled between them. He didn't ask for anything. She didn't offer promises she couldn't keep. They just were, two broken things daring to believe they could fit. When the knock came, he knew. He felt it in his bones before the echo died on the garage door. She flinched, eyes wide. He squeezed her hand once before standing, rolling his shoulders like a fighter stepping into the ring. The man at the door wore a suit that didn't fit this street, flanked by 2 others who smelled like threats. Words were exchanged, soft at first, then sharp enough to cut the stale air. Jace didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. One look at him, grease under his nails, fire in his jaw, and they understood. They left with warnings that tasted like poison on the wind. She collapsed against him the moment the door slammed shut, her breath ragged. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his chest. He held her like she was the only clean thing left in this oil-slick life. "Don't be," he said. "I'd do it again." And he meant it. He meant every word, even as he knew what it might cost him. The city didn't forgive debts like this. Looking at her, the way she looked back unflinching, he found a reason to risk it all. By spring, the ghosts had settled. She handled her world the way she knew best. Meetings, lawyers, signatures that cut deeper than any blade. He didn't ask questions. He stayed in his lane, rebuilt engines by day, rebuilt her by night. She brought light into the places he'd left dark for too long. When it was over, when the men in suits stopped knocking and the shadows stopped crawling up the garage door at midnight, she sat across from him on the old bench and said, "It's time." He knew exactly what she meant. She didn't offer him a mansion or a promise of forever wrapped in silk and champagne. She offered him a choice, a chance to build something new, far from oil stains and flickering neon signs. He looked around his tiny kingdom one last time. The cracked concrete, the battered toolboxes, the smell of gasoline that had been his only constant. Then he looked at her. At the way she fit beside him, without ever asking him to change the things that made him who he was. And he knew she'd planned this all along. She'd come into his life like a storm, pretending to be a breeze. She'd left doors open, he'd bolted shut. She'd fixed the part of him that no wrench could ever reach. And maybe he'd done the same for her. The man who fixed machines, fixing a woman who'd forgotten how to trust the world. Together they left that night, engine purring under a sky full of stars, the city shrinking behind them in the rear view. Mirror, two broken things, two second chances, and somewhere in between, a promise neither of them needed to say out loud.